Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
As predicted here on the Sputnik, increased Russian intervention in the defense of Syria from foreign invasion has begun to turn the tide. The Syrian army, Sons of Syria, every one, have been fighting at enormous sacrifice, a coalition composed of so many foreign countries and terrorist groups, it would take the rest of the program to enumerate them.
Russia's prestige in world opinion, if not the chanceries of many world capitals, has never been higher, at least since the early 1970s.
So for the whys and what nexts, who else would we turn to than Hafsa Kara Mustapha? Hafsa, thanks for coming back on board the Sputnik. Let's start with the why, first of all. Why did Russia choose this time to dramatically increase its intervention in the war in Syria?
Well, because there's a supposedly international-led coalition fighting ISIS, and since actually that coalition got started in trying to weaken ISIS, ISIS has actually expanded and has expanded its reach across the Middle East, is now based in Libya, and therefore we're seeing the most powerful armies in the world actually not neutralize this threat that was actually described as the biggest threat to humanity since Adolf Hitler. So it's become a time. Russia has decided that the time has come to actually intervene and put a stop to all this mess.
Only history will show whether they really were trying to weaken ISIS, of course. You know my thesis. Seems to me improbable, at least implausible, that all these armies, all these air forces could bomb ISIS so much and yet leave them stronger than they were before they began. But if that's the why, I suppose the big question then is, what next? How long is this operation going to last, in your view? What consequences is it likely to have?
The length of the operation is difficult to predict because, of course, we're seeing a lack of communication between all the players. Just this morning, the Russian ambassador actually announced that Britain refused to exchange intelligence with the Russian counterparts. So I think there's going to be difficulty on the terrain. But, of course, in the last fortnight alone, the Russians have made great gains and have considerably weakened ISIS and have pushed them back. So I think we're seeing a very encouraging progress. But I don't think it's the end of things because, obviously, as we've said, there is a desire to maintain ISIS in the region, and of course under the guise that those that the Western coalition is supporting are the supposed moderate terrorists. I mean, I would have assumed that a terrorist is a terrorist. Anyone who blows up infrastructure and slaughters civilians is a terrorist. There shouldn't be a sort of terrorist light and a terrorist heavy, but apparently there is, and therefore there is a lack of will to neutralize ISIS, which will slow down the process. But of course what is encouraging is that in a fortnight alone Russia has made considerable gains, and I think as a result we're seeing the official Syrian army maintain its strong position, actually expand into former ISIS-led territory, and I think that is encouraging. How long that's going to last, that's a different matter.
The mistake you're making is to imagine that terrorists who only half eat your heart, who only half cut your head off, who only half destroy the religious places of minorities and so on, they're not really terrorists. That's what we're being asked to believe. The phantom armies of the opposition, I described them so in Parliament a couple of years ago, that the so-called Free Syrian Army even then didn't exist. And yet we're told now by Western critics of the Russian operation that Russia is somehow bombing them, even though in the United States newspapers, the serious newspapers, it's long been acknowledged that there are no moderate terrorists. There's only Al-Qaeda and the even more extreme ISIS.
As I said, the terrorist organizations are very much the same parties that are just having different labels to them, but they're all acting as terrorists. They're all committing heinous crimes against the civilian population of Syria, which it has to be reminded that the majority of the civilian population is actually Sunni. Now, there's been an idea of selling this conflict as being somewhat the Sunnis fighting the evil Alawite minority. Now, the leadership of Syria is indeed, or rather, Bashar al-Assad is an Alawite, but the majority of the Syrian population is Sunni, and therefore the the majority of the official Syrian army is made up of Sunni fighters who are fighting these terrorists, who are killing them, slaughtering them. They are obviously attacking minorities, but they're also attacking all the Sunnis who are not signing up to their barbaric enterprise. So what we've seen in the past, we've labelled this situation in all the wrong ways possible. We first labelled the terrorists as being somewhat rebels. We've somewhat labelled it as Sunnis versus the others, where that's not the case, because Sunnis are fighting against these terrorists. So every step of the way, we've described the situation in Syria in the wrong way in order to sell a conflict and actually encourage the disintegration of Syria.
Hafsa, we were in Moscow last week, and the last night we were stuck in a huge traffic jam, which we were quite surprised by. Obviously, it's an 11 million city. But then, as we drove past the Kremlin, roads were blocked along it, and we then discovered that Assad was there. For the first time since the war, Assad was there on a visit to a foreign country. That must be significant.
It's very symbolic. It's an official recognition of the Syrian leadership, Bashar's leadership, and it's also a way of telling the West that they don't care what they think of Bashar al-Assad, because obviously Western capitals have insisted that Bashar al-Assad no longer had legitimacy. But of course, a majority of Syrians still view him as his president. It is for the Syrians to decide who their president should be. And I think what the Russian gesture has meant is to say that actually we're recognizing Syrian legitimacy of their president. Here is the president, and there you go. Tough.
What do you think they might have been discussing?
I think they've obviously discussed the nature of further operation, further cooperation between the official Syrian army and the Russian army as well. I think it's to strengthening the ties within the region and ensure that there is a more long-term presence probably in Russia for the foreseeable future. At the very least, to ensure that these US-friendly terrorists, if we can call them that, actually are pushed further and leave Syria alone.
They're likely, of course, to run. Many of them are already running. Unfortunately, some of them to Iraq, where they will still have to be defeated also. But many seem to be running to Turkey. And Turkey itself is now, you could say, almost in a civil war situation. You have such a complex pattern of conflict. You have secularists who don't like Erdogan for their own reasons. You have the Kurdish minority, a very big minority, being attacked by Erdogan and fighting back. You have the overflow of the ISIS and Al-Qaeda phenomenon. The whole region's problems are not going to go away anytime soon, are they?
The reason for that is because so many people actually, rather than attempt to find a solution, really poured fuel under the fire. Now, for many, they would argue that for Erdogan, this is really karma, because when he meddled in Syrian affairs, rather than play the great, important neighbor that should have pushed for a peaceful resolution, actually pushed for conflict. He encouraged the foreign fighters to come in. He allowed Turkey to become a base for foreign mercenaries, murderers, to come into Syria and commit the crimes that we know of. And therefore, it was inevitable that it would spill over. You know, when you play with terrorists, and the Americans have seen this before, the Saudis have seen this before, you inevitably get burned. These are criminals who have absolutely no loyalty and no sense of morality. They will come back and bite you sooner or later.
It is a Frankenstein monster, and Erdogan's blunder, having started out with the policy of no quarrels with the neighbours,
exactly,
ended up with quarrels with all the neighbours. It's a foreign policy error almost as big as Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait 25 years ago, because it may bring about not just the end of his own political power and project, but runs the risk, it's an existential threat actually, to Turkey as a state.
Absolutely, because I think, as you mentioned, all the minorities that are clashing within Turkey, this is a recipe for disaster. Turkey is now at boiling point, and it's such a shame because just a year ago it was actually doing well. Of course, there were the secularists who were against Erdogan, but Erdogan had a comfortable majority. He was quite a popular statesman, regardless. And yet, with a situation that has become poisoned, intoxicated because of the ISIS threat, which has been used almost by all parties, it has led Turkey to becoming this sort of chessboard, which was a bit what Syria was a few years ago. Now that situation has moved into Turkey, and Turkey is pretty much facing the problem Syria was facing 4 years ago. But it has lost many friends, and therefore might not even have the support that Syria is enjoying today.
Let's turn to Iraq. If it's possible to see, if not the end, the beginning of the end of the terrorist attack and occupation of much of Syria, it's not yet possible to see that in Iraq. the Iraqi state does not yet seem capable of recapturing the very significant cities and territories that are still held by ISIS. What's going to happen next there?
Well, I think you pointed out that Saddam Hussein's major error was that when he invaded Kuwait, he actually fractured a lot of the Arab unity. That was a major blunder. But there was something that Saddam Hussein managed to do, was keep a national cohesion. You know, the Iraqis had a strong sense of nationality. With the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the divide and rule politics that were instigated by the US, the sense of nationality has completely disappeared. And now the loyalties are more tribal and more sectarian. So you have people who are thinking, well, why should I fight for a nation state that I don't really believe in? I'm first and foremost a Sunni. I'm first and foremost a Shiite, and therefore there is no sense of fighting in a coordinated way against the common enemy, because everyone is fighting for their own. And this is why ISIS have managed to make incredible gains, and we've seen that at times the Iraqi official army was completely humiliated and defeated within 24 hours simply because the soldiers didn't have it in them to fight for a country that they no longer regard as their nation, and therefore something to be proud of and something to fight for. And I think in that respect it's very difficult to predict an end of the catastrophe in Iraq for the foreseeable future.
Is it possible that Russia could become involved in Iraq also, at the request of the Iraqi government, just as it's involved now at the request of the Syrian government?
Well, I think it's incredible humiliation for the US, because these are people that were placed by the US. This is a government that's come on the back of a US-led invasion, and actually now they're turning to the Russians for help.
That would mean, of course, in this hypothesis, and I've no idea whether Russia has any intention of helping in a big way in Iraq, but that would mean that Russia was now perhaps the most significant international player in the Middle East. Would mean the end of American hegemony in the region, and given Russia's good relations with Iran, would change the balance of power and direction in the Middle East, I believe, in a very good way. What's your take on that?
Well, I think anything that we go far, when we move away from American hegemony, I think that should be celebrated, as we've seen, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Libya, and of course they're meddling in Syria and their support of Israel. Nothing that America has done is to be welcomed in the region. So any time that the Middle East moves further away from the US, I think is very much to be welcomed. And if it's going towards another superpower, I mean, personally, I would favor more independence for the Middle East and not going from one superpower to the other. Having said that, anything that moves away from the US is obviously something beneficial for the region, definitely.
Hafsa, thanks as always for your expertise. Coming up after the break, clear the decks. It's Max Keiser. Welcome back to Sputnik. Max Keiser is one of the world's most watched broadcasters. He's feared by the bad, loved by the good. He's the Robin Hood of the square mile, and he's here now. Light the blue touch paper and stand well back. There's no point in a script here, Max.
No!
Because talking with you is pure free-form jazz. But let me try and pose.
I channel the anger of millions.
You do. You do. You
I
really,
feel
really,
I feel their pain.
Now let me just, there's one I need to ask you about because it's particularly important, significant for me. There's a report in the newspapers this week that £100 billion in property purchases has been made in London in just the last 6 years by foreign nationals. What's going on here? This must be the reason why house prices and rents in London are now higher than anywhere else in the world. Am I right?
Absolutely. There's the piggy bank, London property. Foreign money comes in, and it's cheaper than opening a bank account in some other country. It's cheaper than owning gold or silver. But, you know, I was looking at this housing situation in London, George, and, you know, the housing associations, which are private property, George Osborne is allowing those to be sold off.
Yep.
So this is a confiscation of private property, and they're going to kick people out onto the streets. You know, this is beyond just a confiscation of private property. This is Osborne's, Hugo Chavez moment. And this is owned by private property owners, and they're just taking it away, and they're reselling it at a huge discount. And, this is a human rights issue. This can go to the International Criminal Court because he's disenfranchising this entire generation that's being thrown out into the street. Why don't we go to the ICC? Why isn't this not discussed in these terms? This is a criminal action by Osborne, the Chancellor. That's just one area of law breaking that I've identified. Another area of law breaking that I've identified here is that this country, they do what's called these PPI schemes or PFI schemes, where their government is putting off their balance sheet the debt of doing their privatizations for things like hospitals and things like this. And they say, well, the reason we don't do this debt, the reason we don't the low interest rates that are afforded to us from the Bank of England at 0% interest rates is because under the Maastricht Treaty, we're not allowed to go above 60% debt to GDP. But I'm sorry, but in fact, they are violating that 60% debt to GDP. They are violating the Maastricht Treaty. And Mark Carney, who runs the Bank of England, knows this. He's the regulator ultimately in charge. He's now been caught flagrantly violating international law. So these guys, when it comes to property in London, not only are they opening it up to the foreign billions that are ill-gotten gains, that are jacking up hot money, jacking up prices, forcing people out of the market, they are also committing wholesale human rights violations and rampant criminality.
They did it before, by the way, before you came here, with council housing. Millions of council houses have been sold at knockdown prices, virtually nothing, which is, of course, a loss then to the public that built those houses.
Those were owned by the state. But the housing associations are not state-owned. They are privately owned. And they're selling private property, again, to other private property.
By fiat. They're selling private property to a larger number of smaller private owners. And that means that rented economy, that rented sector, is no longer available to those who wish to or need to live in rented property.
Yeah, but they go and criticize these countries. You know, I've mentioned Hugo Chavez before, okay? If you listen to Osborne and Cameron, they'll say, Hugo Chavez is a socialist. He's confiscating private property from people and doing wealth redistribution. Well, it's exactly what Osborne's doing. He's confiscating private property, and he's doing upward wealth redistribution by giving it to those who are hoarding properties. They're property hoarders, you know, and that's completely inconsistent with a functioning economy. You don't want one sector, the property sector, acting like a parasitical cancer, gobbling up all of the pieces of the economy. That's completely inconsistent with having a well-functioning economy.
Well, we saw in the newspapers last week an EastEnders actor funded by Israeli financiers, their nationality is immaterial, to buy his council house in Hampstead, so that it could be knocked down and a fantastically more valuable house erected in its place. And the EastEnders actor, who happens to be a tenant there and who gets the discount, will be compensated by the Israeli financiers, and somebody worth 20, 30, 40 million pounds will now occupy that space.
Compensated from who? It's compensated from the council. It's compensated from the taxpayer. It's compensated through money printing, which is causing gross wealth and income inequality and social unrest. And if Osborne wants to know why there is potentially such social unrest in this country, look in the mirror. He's engineering it. It's financial engineering. I mean, this is Britain's crystal knocked. Okay, this is Osborne's crystal knocked. He's given open season to private speculators to kick private citizens out of their homes and resell those properties. I'm not over gilding the lily. This is an atrocious violation of human rights, Osborne. He should be going to The Hague. Along with Tony Blair.
Just in the interest of balance, the George Osborne, whom you've criticized severely, and as I do myself, last week we saw the triumph of his pragmatism over the ideological positions of the Foreign Office and even David Cameron. It's Osborne who's driving the new opening to China in British policy. The wisdom to get close to China and to become a pivot in Europe and the world for the increasingly strong, fundamentally increasingly strong Chinese economy. This is wisdom on the part of Osborne. Of course, he's doing it because he wants Chinese money to come to Britain. But what's wrong with that?
He's engineered a remarkable economic atrocity by sending jobs to China in exchange for hot money that's being enabled by these ultra-low interest rates. Here's what's been going on for the last 20 years. This country, these policymakers in Britain, just had a choice. Either let jobs stay in Britain and let wages rise to go with those jobs and have a natural organic inflation and a well-balanced economy, or ship those jobs overseas to China and other countries and monkey around with the economy through the mechanism of interest rate manipulation, through extra low interest rate manipulation. And this is what has attracted this Chinese hot money, because they can come in with this money that is being deposited in these properties here, and they know that because the Bank of England is going to keep printing now more than £1 trillion to try to bail out the banks, they're guaranteed some kind of return on this hot money. So they're giving a state subsidy to China to deposit their hot money in China. They're not doing anything for wages or work here in Britain, because all those jobs are being sent over to China. The same thing is happening in America. And the quid pro quo sucks. You know, China, if Osborne thinks he's getting something for this, he's going to get a revolution is what he's going to get. He's engineering complete insurrection in this country, and it can't happen a day too soon, because these people need some dignity, George. These British people, they can't live on gin and promises. They need some sovereignty. They need some dignity.
I did try, Mr. Osborne. I did try.
Well, why does he come on my show? Nobody from that administration ever comes on my show. I'm freaking right across the street from the mayor's office. Did they ever pop over to say a word? No, because they know I'll skin them alive. They'll be flayed on television and their hypocrisy exposed like a banana being peeled.
Look, let me stick with Osborne for a minute. His chances of becoming Prime Minister, or at least leader of the Conservative Party, vis-à-vis Boris Johnson, the aforementioned mayor, depend on the British economy in 2020. If there's a significant downturn in the British economy, Boris Johnson will succeed. If there isn't, George Osborne will succeed. What's your money on?
Pop in the real estate property bubble is a dead certainty. Therefore, under the choice that you just provided, it would be, therefore, Boris Johnson.
So you see, maybe 2017, 2018, you see a significant fall in the British economy.
It's a global economy is now running with a $200 trillion debt load. The debt to GDP in Britain, if you include bank debt, public debt, private debt, is running at over 800%. Debt to GDP. Not far off to where Iceland was before Iceland blew up. And by the way, Iceland just put 27 bankers in jail this week for doing the exact same stuff that English and British bankers have been doing during the same time period. Why does Iceland have a respect for the rule of law? And Britain has no respect.
National dignity. The Icelandic people thus demonstrated national dignity.
Max, the public was as excited as we are to have you on our show, so we've got some questions from them, if you like.
Hit me.
Hit you. John Fay, for example, wants you to discuss the changes you would bring to the financial sector in London if you were in charge.
Look, there's really only one way to restore balance to this sector and bring some accountability. Raise the cost of fraud. Right now, it's almost free ride on committing financial fraud because the cost of borrowing money is zero. Therefore, the cost of committing fraud is almost zero. So by raising that cost of fraud, by increasing the risk of committing fraud, you're going to reduce the amount of fraud being committed because the fraudsters right now are just being given a free ride. The vault of the safe is wide open. There's nobody watching it. There's no oversight. There's no law. So how can you blame people from just walking up and stealing all the money? Of course, they're going to do that. You need to close the vault door. You need to put a cage around the money. You need to increase the risk.
Pele says, what good is terrorism for the UK businesses like weapon sale, GCHQ spying, banksters, corporations?
The terrorism business has never been more profitable for the UK. You know, I am quite amused whenever I see the likes of Piers Morgan tweeting about America's gun culture from inside the British establishment, the biggest exporter of arms to the world, the biggest mass slaughtering machine.
Now Saudi Arabia's biggest arms supplier. How's that for terrorism?
Right, okay.
In fact, the arms we're selling to Saudi Arabia are ending up in the hands of ISIS and Al-Qaeda before they're even unpacked out the boxes.
Right, so where is the media on this? Where's the BBC? Where is Piers Morgan? He's out there saying, oh, America, they got too many guns in America, somebody just got shot in America. Piers, you're sponsoring the biggest state terrorist in the world, the United Kingdom.
Max.
What?
Say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thanks very much. The one and only inimitable Max Keiser for coming on the Sputnik. Alas, and I really mean that, That's all we've got time for, and it's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on Twitter at RT_Sputnik or on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It really has been marvellous.